Equity markets in July continued to push ahead, up around 3% in local terms, bringing their year-to-date total up about 18%. So really good year for equities. In this episode, at the end of the month, we always try and gather our thoughts on what happened in July. I'm delighted to be joined by Dean Cook. Dean, you're very welcome. You're in the hot seat. I'm going to ask you, what are your three main trends that you saw in July?
Thanks, Peter. Let's kick off with inflation as the first one. We saw tentative evidence that the US economy is potentially moving towards disinflation. So that's where the rate of inflation starts to come down with the June CPI print that was released last month. Core inflation fell to 4.8% year on year versus 5.3% the prior month. Now, still a high number, but it's moving in the right direction. And this is critical for the Fed and its decisions over whether or not to keep on raising interest rates. We saw similar trends in Europe and the UK, although probably to a lesser extent. So it's likely that we'll see an interest rate hike from the Bank of England at their next meeting and potentially from the ECB as well. Japan, in contrast, moving the other direction, they see continued inflation pressure, and that prompted a surprise tweak to some of their monetary policy settings, which we'll get to in a moment.
Okay, so that's interesting. Inflation gradually coming down, but still quite a way to go when we think about central banks having that 2% target. What's your second point of July?
No surprises for guessing. The second one is interest rates. July saw continued interest rate rises from the ECB, Fed, and the Bank of England. That being said, the rhetoric from said central banks is beginning to shift. Both the Fed and the ECB have shifted to a strictly data-dependent approach on future rate decisions. The Bank of England might be a couple of steps behind in that there's a bit more pressure there and a greater number of interest rate rises currently expected by the market. As I mentioned, the Bank of Japan kind of going in the opposite direction. They surprised the market with a tweak to what part of their monetary policy is around targeting particular levels of yield called yield curve control. This is where they keep the target for the 10-year JGB at about 0% with a band around it. And this month they surprised the market by moving the bands. That allows the government bond yield to start drifting up from its current level and effectively sets Japan on the path towards policy normalization.
Okay, that's really interesting. When I look at bond returns in July, relatively flat across the board. So that's inflation and interest rates. Big surprises. Those are two topics for July. Number three.
Earnings season. Approximately half of the companies in the S&P 500 have reported Q2 results, and probably a similar proportion of the European market as well. Of the S&P 500, 82% have reported earnings above consensus, which is somewhere above the historical average and sort of demonstrates a decent beat that will give some optimism into the market. Earnings reports in Europe weren't quite as positive in terms of the level of beats and earnings growth, but that's mostly down to a higher weighting in energy and basic resources companies in Europe relative to the US, and also some of the energy advantages that the US has over Europe. What the market's going to be looking for over the coming quarters is the extent to which the decline in inflation rates, that disinflation, starts to bring down revenue growth, or if companies are able to firstly grow organically and secondly maintain margins to grow underlying earnings.
Okay, so if I was to summarize what you just went through, those 3 points, I suppose inflation coming down, which is a positive. Interest rates, it seems central banks are beginning to let the markets know that we're getting to a terminal end rate in these raising cycle that we've seen. And thirdly, company earnings, you mentioned that 82% beats. That's positive too. So, I mean, we're in a positive place at the moment for markets. Hence, we've seen pretty good returns over the last number of months. Dean, that's really interesting. Great to cover that. One thing I always try and cover as well in our month-end episode is an interesting stat for the month. Happened this week relating to earnings. Uber, the sort of person and food delivery company, made its first quarterly operating profit. Over the last 10 years, it made its first quarterly operating profit. This quarter, it has burnt through about 32 billion in cash over the last 10 years. So that's a big milestone for them. So that's my stat of the month. Dean, thank you for your time today. We'll be back again next week with a topic that's caught our eye.